My name is Serena. I'm 36 years old, and my family threw my sister a surprise party on a Saturday in September and forgot to tell me. I found out from a photograph, not a phone call, not an apology the next morning, a photograph that appeared in my feed on a Sunday afternoon, posted by my aunt, showing 30 people in my parents' living room with gold balloons and a 3-tier cake, and my sister standing in the middle of it with both hands over her mouth in that specific way people stand when they've genuinely been surprised. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I ordered something from my sister's registry, wrote her a card, told her I was sorry I missed it and that I hoped she felt how loved she was. I signed it with love. I meant every word. When the gift arrived, my mother called to thank me. She said, "You're so thoughtful, Serena. You've always been the thoughtful one." And then there was a pause that was doing something, a pause that knew something I didn't yet. I said thank you, and we moved on, and I did not ask about the party. 3 weeks later, my grandmother called. She said, "Come over, alone. Don't tell your mother." And something in those 7 words, not the words themselves, but the specific weight behind them, the way she said, "Don't tell your mother," like it was protection rather than preference, told me this had nothing to do with a party. Before I go any further, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and your local time. I genuinely read every single one. Now let me take you back. I grew up the older of 2 daughters in a family that functioned well on the surface and organized itself around an invisible preference underneath. My parents were not unkind people. My father worked hard and came home consistently and showed up to the things that required showing up. My mother kept a warm house, cooked real food, knew the names of our friends. They loved their children. I have never doubted that. But there is a kind of love that is distributed evenly and a kind that has a direction. And in our house, from the time I was old enough to notice the difference, the love had a direction. My sister's name is Camille. She is 5 years younger than me, which meant that by the time she arrived with any real personality, I was already established in my role, already understood by the family as the one who managed herself. Camille arrived and she was warm and expressive and needed things openly, needed reassurance and presence and collective attention. And the family gave her those things the way you give a plant what it needs to grow. I needed things too. I was just quieter about it. And in my family, quiet need was the kind that went unaddressed, not out of cruelty, but out of something more difficult to name, out of the assumption that quiet need was being handled, that the person not asking was the person not requiring. That assumption followed me for 36 years. My grandmother's name is Frances. She is 83, my father's mother, and she has lived alone in the same house since my grandfather died 11 years ago. The house is 45 minutes from my parents, and I visited her regularly, more regularly than anyone else in the family did, which was something she acknowledged once with a directness that I appreciated. She said, "You come more than the others." Not as a compliment, just as a fact she had noted. Frances had always spoken to me differently than she spoke to the rest of the family, less performance in it, less of the managed warmth that characterized family gatherings. She asked me questions and waited for the real answer rather than the social one. She told me things about her own life that I understood were not told to everyone. There was a quality of mutual recognition between us that I had always been grateful for without fully understanding what it was based on. When she called with those 7 words, I understood for the first time that maybe it was based on something more specific than temperament. Let me tell you about the party properly, not just the being excluded, the architecture of it. In August, about 6 weeks before the party, my mother called me during the week, which was normal, and asked whether I was coming home for the last weekend of September. She said it casually, floating it as a general question. I said I had a work thing that might overlap, but I'd check and let her know. She said, "No rush, it's nothing formal." Nothing formal. I have thought about those 2 words many times. I ended up having a conflict that weekend, a work event that ran longer than expected and required me to stay in the city. I texted my mother on the Friday to let her know I couldn't make it. She replied within minutes. She said, "No worries at all, we'll see you soon." No worries at all. Not, "We'll miss you." Not, "Camille will be disappointed." Not any of the things you might say if the person missing an occasion was going to be missed. Just no worries at all? I have thought about that response too. The photograph went up the following afternoon. 30 people, gold balloons, my sister with her hands over her mouth, and behind her, slightly to the left, my father with a look on his face that I had seen there before at moments of particular family significance. That personal pride, the warm kind. I was not in any of the photographs, not because I wasn't there, because nobody had thought to send them to me or include me in the thread where they were being shared. I found the public post, the private ones, the ones the family sent around on the group message. I found out about 2 weeks later when my cousin mentioned something she'd seen in them. I was not on that group message either. The card I wrote took me longer than it should have. I am a methodical person by nature. I work in urban planning, which rewards the ability to hold multiple complex variables in mind simultaneously and make decisions without emotional interference. I am not a person who labors over greeting cards, but I labored over this one. I was trying to achieve something precise. I wanted the card to be genuinely warm. I wanted there to be no trace in it of injury or reproach. Not because I was suppressing those things, I was still working out whether I actually felt them, but because I needed the card to reflect something true about me. That whatever my family's organization was, my love for my sister was not contingent on it, that I could be excluded from a party and still show up, still sign something with love and mean it. I was 36 years old and I needed to prove that to myself. I sent the card, I sent the gift, I meant every word. And when Camille called to thank me, she said, "I want you to know," and then stopped mid-sentence in a way that felt deliberate, like she had prepared something and then decided against it at the last moment. She said instead, "I'm really glad you're my sister." She said it with a weight that the moment didn't fully explain. I said, "I'm glad too. I have been thinking about that stopped sentence ever since." My mother's call came 2 days after the gift arrived. "You're so thoughtful, Serena. You've always been the thoughtful one." I have been a compliance professional long enough to recognize when someone is answering a question that wasn't asked. She went straight to the compliment. No acknowledgement of the absence. No explanation of the planning. No "sorry you couldn't make it." Just the compliment placed where something else could have been. "You've always been the thoughtful one." Which is a thing you say about a person when you need what they're doing to be about their character rather than your accounting. I said thank you. I noted it. In the weeks between my mother's call and my grandmother's, I started paying attention in a different way. I had always been an observer in my family. That was well established. But I had been observing the way you observe when you believe the system is essentially fair and you are just cataloging its textures. Now I was observing differently. I was looking for pattern rather than detail, and patterns require a wider frame than details do. My father sent a group message about Christmas plans in early October. I found out about it from my aunt. I was not on the thread. A week later, my mother mentioned to Camille. Camille told me on a call, casually, not realizing the significance, that she had spoken to the family solicitor about updating some paperwork. My mother did not mention this to me. 2 days after that, Camille called me late on a Wednesday, after 10. She asked what I was up to that week. She asked whether I'd been in touch with Grandma Frances lately. She asked it lightly, easily. I said I'd been meaning to call her. Camille said, "She mentioned to Mom that she'd been thinking about you." She said it like it was nothing. It was not nothing. My grandmother had called me 4 days before that conversation. She had told me to come alone. She had told me not to tell my mother. And now Camille was calling me late on a Wednesday to mention that my grandmother had been thinking about me, as though she had been asked to find out something without appearing to find it out. I said, "That's sweet. I'll give her a call." Camille said, "She'd love that." We said goodnight. I sat with the phone in my hand and felt the conversation settle around me, the specific texture of it, the lateness of the call, the casual question that wasn't casual, the information about the solicitor that my mother hadn't shared directly, the group threads I wasn't on, the party I hadn't been invited to, the card I'd written, and the pause in my mother's voice, and the sentence my sister had stopped herself from finishing. They were not separate things. They were the same thing, looked at from different angles. I didn't know yet what the thing was. That was the part I was missing. The shape of it was becoming visible, but the substance was still obscured. And I understood that the substance was what my grandmother had been sitting alone with in that house for however long she had been sitting with it. She hadn't called me to comfort me about a party. She had called me because something was in motion, something involving paperwork and solicitors and group messages I wasn't on, and a sister who called after 10 to ask casual questions that were not casual. And she had decided, after however long, that I needed to know. I texted her that night. I said, "Thursday morning, I'll be there by 10. She replied 1 minute later. She said, "Good, come to the back door." The back door, not the front. I put my phone down and looked at the ceiling of my apartment and thought about a woman of 83 who had watched this family for decades from the particular vantage point of someone who built it, and who was now asking her granddaughter to come in through the back door and bring something to write with. Thursday morning I got up early. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Camille. I drove to Francis's house in the early October light, and I parked on the side street rather than the driveway, and I walked around to the back of the house. And I knocked, and I waited, and the door opened, and my grandmother looked at me with those clear, settled eyes and said, "Good, come in. There's a lot I should have told you sooner." She had the kettle already on. That was the first thing I noticed, not a small thing in the context of Frances. She was a woman who did not prepare for people she was not certain were coming. The fact that the kettle was on meant she had known I would come from the moment she sent that text, maybe before. I sat at the kitchen table, the back kitchen, the one that faced the garden that I had sat in dozens of times over the years. It smelled the same as it always had. Something warm and slightly floral, a combination of whatever she kept in the drawer by the stove and the particular age of the house itself, familiar in a way that made the unfamiliarity of the situation sit more strangely against it. She poured 2 cups and sat across from me, and she did not ease into it. She said, "Your grandfather changed his will 8 months before he died." I looked at her. She said, "The version that was filed with the estate was not the version he wrote last." I put my cup down. She said, "The last version named you specifically, not the family collectively, not divided between his children. You, by name, with a separate designation, a property and a fund attached to it. He wanted you to have it directly." I said, "What property?" She said, "The cottage, the one in..." And she named a place I knew. A place I had been to as a child, a small stone cottage 2 hours north that my grandfather had bought in the late 80s, before my father was grown, that had sat in the family's peripheral awareness my whole life as a thing that existed and was occasionally mentioned and never quite discussed directly. I said, "He left me the cottage." She said, "In the last version, yes." I said, "What happened to it?" She looked at her cup for a moment, not avoiding the answer, preparing the delivery of it. She said, "It was absorbed into the general estate. The version that went through probate listed it as an undivided family asset to be managed at your father's discretion." At your father's discretion. I had heard that phrase before. In a different context, in a different story, it would have sounded neutral. In this kitchen, on this morning, it sounded like exactly what it was. I said, "Who filed the probate documents?" She said, "Your father handled the estate." I said, "And the last version of the will." She said, "Was not submitted." The garden outside the window was very still, a late October garden past its color, just the structure of things remaining. I looked at it and let what she had said find its place in me. My grandfather had left me something specific, something with his name on it and mine. And somewhere between his death and the settling of his estate, that specific thing had become a general thing, managed at my father's discretion, which meant managed without my knowledge and without my name attached to it any longer. I said, "How long have you known?" She said, "I suspected from the beginning. I knew for certain about 14 months ago." She paused. A solicitor contacted me, not your father's solicitor, one your grandfather had used separately toward the end for the updated documents. He had been trying to reach you directly. The contact information he had was old. He found me instead. I said, "Why didn't you call me then?" She looked at me steadily. She said, "Because I needed to understand the full shape of it before I handed it to you, and because I wanted to be certain before I said something that would change things permanently between you and your father." She said it without apology, just explanation. She had been sitting on this for 14 months, turning it over, making sure. That was a particular kind of love, slow and careful and more concerned with getting it right than with the relief of disclosure. I said, "Are you certain now?" She said, "Yes." She told me the rest over the next hour. My grandfather, in the last year of his life, had become concerned about what he called the family's patterns. He had used that word to her specifically, patterns. He had watched his son's household for decades, and he had seen what I had seen, expressed in a different register, the quiet organization of a family around a preference. He had watched me grow up and manage myself and ask for nothing and receive accordingly. And in the way of people who arrive at clarity late but arrive there genuinely, he had decided to do something about it with the only instrument he had left. He had gone to a separate solicitor, one my father didn't know, and he had updated his will. The cottage had been valued, at the time of his death, at significantly more than the family had ever discussed it as being worth. There had been renovations in the years prior. There had also been a rental income, managed quietly, that had been accumulating. My grandfather had set aside a fund specifically tied to the property, designated for me. None of this had reached me. The property was currently being managed by my father. The rental income was going somewhere. 14 months ago, a solicitor named Owen Marsh had found my grandmother and told her what he knew and what he suspected, and given her a copy of the document my grandfather had signed. She got up from the table and went to the drawer by the window and came back with a folder. She put it in front of me. She said, "He made a copy for me. He said to keep it somewhere your father wouldn't think to look." I opened the folder. My grandfather's handwriting on the amended pages, his signature at the bottom, witnessed and dated. My name in the document, specific and deliberate, the way you write a name when you want there to be no ambiguity about intention. I sat with it for a long moment, then I took out my phone and I photographed every page. Frances watched me do it and said nothing. She had known I would do exactly that. I asked her about the party before I left. Not because it was the most important thing, but because it was the thread I had started pulling, and I needed to know if it connected to the rest. She said, "The party was your mother's idea. She's been trying to consolidate things, keep Camille close, keep the family narrative simple, keep you at a comfortable distance without creating a formal break. A family that functions is easier to manage than one with visible fractures." I said, "Comfortable distance." She said, "You ask questions. You always have. Not aggressively, but you notice things and eventually you ask about them. Your mother understands that about you. Camille does not ask questions. Your mother finds that easier." I said, "Camille called me the Wednesday before I came here. She asked about you." She asked casually. Frances said, "Your mother asked her to." She said it simply, not with drama, just the fact. My mother had known Frances was thinking about reaching out, not the specifics, not the folder, but she had sensed something, and she had deployed Camille to find out what I knew. And Camille had made the call. I thought about my sister, about the warmth that was genuine in her, about the stop sentence on the phone call after the gift arrived, about the weight behind, "I'm really glad you're my sister," I said. "Does Camille know about the will?" Frances said, "No, I don't believe so. I think your sister knows something is uneven without knowing the specific shape of it. She has more conscience than she has been given credit for, but she has also been inside the family system long enough that her knowing and her acting on knowing are two different things." I sat with that. Then I picked up the folder and put it carefully in my bag. Frances walked me to the back door. She held my hand for a moment before I left and she said, "Owen Marsh is still the solicitor on record for the original amended document. He has been waiting. He said to tell you, "When you're ready, not before." I said, "What does ready look like?" She said, "You'll know." I drove home in the kind of quiet that isn't empty, the kind that is very full and needs to be given space. I called Owen Marsh the following morning. He answered like he had been expecting the call, which he had been for 14 months. He was measured and precise in the way that good solicitors are measured and precise. He confirmed what Frances had told me and then went several layers deeper. The amended will was legally valid. It had been properly witnessed and dated and filed with his office. The version submitted to probate had been an earlier document, and the discrepancy was not an oversight. He had looked into it carefully, and the word he used, twice, was deliberate. He said the cottage was currently listed in my father's name, having been transferred after probate. It was actively generating rental income. The fund my grandfather had designated had been redirected. He had documentation of the rental income across the past several years. He said my grandfather had been thorough. He had anticipated the possibility of the amended will being set aside and had left detailed instructions with Owen about what to do if contact was ever established with me. I said, "What were the instructions?" He said, "To give you time to decide what you wanted to do, and to tell you that whatever you decided," he understood. He said to tell you directly. He was sorry it had taken him as long as it did to see things clearly. He wanted that on record. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up, my grandfather apologizing from beyond a document, trying to get a message through the machinery of his own family, trusting a solicitor and an 83-year-old woman with a folder in a kitchen drawer to make sure it reached me. It had taken 11 years, but it had reached me. I went to my parents' house that Sunday. I had not planned to go so soon, but I wanted to see the room now that I knew what I knew. I wanted to watch the surface of things with the truth underneath it visible to me and invisible to them. My mother opened the door and hugged me and said, "This is a nice surprise." She said it warmly and meant the warmth genuinely, which was the thing about my mother that made everything more complicated. She was not a cold woman. She was a woman who had made decisions from inside a set of priorities she had never fully examined, and the warmth was real, even when what it was covering was not. My father was in the living room. He stood up and hugged me. He asked about work. He seemed, if anything, slightly more attentive than usual, more deliberate about eye contact, as though someone had suggested to him recently that he should be more present with me. Camille was there too. She had come for Sunday lunch. She smiled when I walked in, and the smile had something behind it. Not guilt exactly, awareness. The awareness of someone who has done a small thing they are not entirely comfortable with and is hoping the person they did it to doesn't know. I smiled back. I sat down. I ate lunch. I watched all three of them move around the surface of the afternoon with the particular care of people managing something they believed I was unaware of, and I felt the strange double clarity of knowing what they didn't know I knew. My father mentioned the cottage once, in passing, as if testing a frequency. He said, "I've been thinking of selling the cottage. The upkeep is getting complicated." He said it to no one in particular. Looking at his plate, my mother said nothing. Camille said nothing. I said, just that, just enough to register without revealing. My father looked up briefly and then back at his plate, and I understood that the conversation about the cottage was not actually about the cottage. It was about whether I would react, whether I knew something, whether the frequency would produce a response. I gave him nothing. I helped clear the table after lunch. I said the food was wonderful. I hugged my mother at the door. I drove home with the folder photographed on my phone and Owen Marsh's number saved in my contacts and the full shape of something that had been forming my entire life, now completely visible. They thought I was still in the dark. They had no idea that the dark had been lit for 5 days. And somewhere in that house, my father was thinking about selling a cottage that, if Owen Marsh was right about the document in that folder, had not been his to sell for 11 years. I pulled onto the motorway. I thought about what ready looks like, and I thought, I think I'm almost there. I gave it 2 weeks, not because I was afraid, not because I was building toward something dramatic. I gave it 2 weeks because I had learned, in 36 years of being the observant one, in a family that preferred its members unobservant, that timing is its own form of preparation. Rush toward a truth and people feel ambushed, and ambushed people defend rather than receive. Let the truth arrive at the right moment and something different becomes possible. I spent those 2 weeks being methodical. I met with Owen Marsh in person on a Tuesday. His office was small and orderly, and he had everything prepared in a way that told me he had been preparing for this meeting for a long time. He walked me through the full documentation, the amended will, the witness signatures, the dating, the legal validity of the document against the one submitted to probate. He explained what remedies were available and what each path would require. I asked questions. He answered all of them without hedging. At the end of the meeting, he said, "Your grandfather was specific about one thing. He did not want this to be used to punish anyone. He wanted it corrected. There's a difference." I said, "I know the difference." He said, "I believed you would." I left his office with a clear understanding of exactly what I had, exactly what it meant, and exactly what I was going to do with it. I called my father on a Thursday evening. I said I was coming up that weekend. I said I wanted to talk about some family things, paperwork and practical matters, things that were better handled in person. I kept my voice even and my language vague and my tone warm enough that nothing in the call would register as a warning. He said, "Of course, come Saturday, we'll have lunch." I said, "Just us, if that's okay. You and Mom, I'd rather it be a smaller conversation." A pause. Then he said, "Sure, of course." I had one more call to make before Saturday. I called Camille on the Friday. She answered quickly with that slightly braced quality she'd had in her voice since September. I said, "I'm going to see Mom and Dad tomorrow. I wanted to let you know, not to invite you, just to tell you. There are some things I need to talk through with them, and I think it'll be easier without an audience." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Serena, is everything okay?" I said, "It will be." She said, "I made that call, the one in October. I know you know I made it." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry. I didn't fully understand what I was doing. Mom asked, and I didn't ask why." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Are you going to be okay tomorrow?" I said, "Yes. And Camille, whatever happens with our parents, you and I are separate from it. I need you to know that." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, the voice of someone who had been holding something and was relieved to put it down. She said, "Thank you." I said good night. Saturday arrived the way significant days do, unremarkably. The same light, the same drive, the same house at the end of it. My mother opened the door and hugged me, and there was lunch on the table, and the afternoon had the surface texture of any other visit. We ate, we talked about the usual things. I was present and warm and gave them nothing in my manner that suggested what was underneath it. After lunch, my father suggested the sitting room. We moved, we settled. And then my father said, with the controlled casualness of someone who had been preparing this, "You mentioned paperwork. What's on your mind?" I said, "I want to talk about Grandpa's estate." My mother's hands, which had been relaxed in her lap, changed position slightly. My father said, "What about it? That was settled years ago." I said, "Not entirely." He said, "Serena, the estate was handled properly. There was a will, it went through probate." I said, "There were 2 wills." The room changed, not loudly, just the way a room changes when something that has been a secret stops being one, a kind of atmospheric shift, a pressure alteration. My father said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Grandpa updated his will 8 months before he died. He used a separate solicitor, a man named Owen Marsh, because he wanted the update to be handled independently. The amended document named me specifically, the cottage, and a designated fund, by name, with clear intention." My mother said, "Where did you—" Then she stopped. My father said, "Serena, I don't know what you've been told, but—" I said, "The document is legally valid. It was properly witnessed and dated, and Owen Marsh has held the original for 11 years. The version submitted to probate was an earlier document. Owen has reviewed the discrepancy carefully. He uses the word deliberate." My father looked at his hands. My mother said, It wasn't like that. There was confusion about which document was current. Your grandfather had multiple drafts. I said, The final version was dated, signed, and witnessed. There was no ambiguity about which was current. She said, We thought. I said, Mom. Just her name. Said quietly. She stopped. I said, I'm not here to have an argument about what you thought. I'm here because this needs to be resolved. Not dramatically, not in court if we can avoid it, but it needs to be resolved, and it needs to be done honestly. My father said, What are you asking for? I said, What Grandpa designated, the cottage, or its current value given the 11 years of appreciation, the rental income that has been collected and redirected. Owen has documentation of all of it. My father looked up. I said, He's been thorough. Grandpa made sure of that. There was a long silence. My mother had her hand over her mouth. She was not performing distress. She was experiencing something real, and I watched it move through her, and I did not harden against it. She was a woman arriving at the cost of a decision she had made a long time ago and filed under necessity. The cost had just appeared in her sitting room on a Saturday afternoon in the form of her older daughter, calm and documented. My father said, We would have needed to sell the cottage to... I said, I know the finances are complicated. Owen understands that too. There are ways to structure this that don't require an immediate sale. That's a conversation for the solicitors. He said, You've already talked to a solicitor. I said, Yes. He said, When? I said, 2 weeks ago. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before. It was not anger. It was something closer to recognition, the recognition of someone who has underestimated a situation and understands now precisely and too late that they have done so. He said, How long have you known? I said, Long enough. He said, Francis. Not a question. I said, She waited 14 months to tell me. She wanted to be certain before she changed things permanently. That should tell you something about how seriously she took it. My mother said quietly, I didn't think you'd... We thought you had what you needed. You've always been so capable, so independent. And there it was, the sentence that had followed me my whole life, arriving here at the end of everything, still in the same shape, still doing the same work, still trying to make my capability the reason why less was acceptable. I said, I know you believe that. I think you needed to believe it because the alternative was admitting that what you were giving me and what you were giving Camille were not the same thing. And I think once you'd made that decision once, it became the story you told yourself about me. She doesn't need it. She's fine. She'll manage. My mother's eyes were bright. I said, I did manage. I have managed. That was never in question. But managing without something is not the same as not being owed it. The room was very quiet. My father said, I'm sorry, Serena. 4 words, no conditions attached, no justification following them. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, I know. I said it because I believed it, and because sorry in this context was not the ending. It was the beginning of a different kind of accounting. The solicitors would handle the rest. I stood up about 20 minutes later. There was nothing else that needed to be said that afternoon. Owen would contact my father's solicitor on Monday. The process would take time, it would be uncomfortable and detailed, and would require honesty from people who had practiced a different approach for a long time. But it would happen. I knew it would happen, because my grandfather had made sure of it 11 years ago, when he sat in a small office with a careful man and signed a document and trusted that eventually it would find the person it was written for. It found her. My mother walked me to the door. She hugged me and I let her, and it was the complicated hug of a relationship that had been reorganized by truth and was still finding its new shape. She said, I love you. She meant it. I said, I know. I walked to my car. I did not look back, not because I was done with them, not because the love had gone out of it, but because I have learned that there are moments where looking back is not reflection, it is hesitation. And I had done all my reflecting. What was behind me was in the right hands now. What was in front of me was mine. I drove home in the October light and I thought about my grandfather sitting in an office, writing my name into a document, trusting the machinery of honesty to outlast the machinery of silence. It did. It always does, eventually. So here is what happened, in plain language. I was excluded from a party and sent a gift anyway. I wrote a card and signed it with love. My grandmother called me and told me to come alone. I went. She showed me a folder. I made phone calls. I gathered information quietly. I went back to my parents' house on a Saturday, and I sat in their sitting room and I told them the truth in a calm voice, with documentation. And I watched a story that had been running for 11 years come to its necessary end. I did not shout. I did not accuse. I did not perform grief or demand apology. I just showed up prepared. And now I want to leave you with something that has nothing to do with wills or cottages or legal documents. It is this: the quietest people in a family often know the most. They have been watching longer, listening more carefully, filing things that others assume went unnoticed. If you have been the quiet one, the capable one, the one who manages herself, the one who doesn't need the fuss, I want you to understand something about that role. It was assigned to you. You did not choose it. And the assignment was not a recognition of your strength. It was a convenience dressed as one. Your strength is real, but it was never a reason to give you less. And here's the harder thing, the thing that took me 36 years to understand fully. The people who gave you less were not always giving more to others out of malice. Sometimes they were giving more to others out of habit, and calling the habit fairness, and calling your silence consent. You are allowed to correct the record, not with anger, with preparation, with documentation, with the calm voice of someone who has done the work and knows exactly what she's carrying when she walks through the door. I want to end differently today. I'm not going to ask you to comment or share, though if this found you, you already know whether it did. I just want to ask you to sit with one thing before you close this. Think of the folder in your own life. Not a legal document necessarily, just the thing that has been waiting in a drawer somewhere, the truth you've been handed in pieces and haven't yet assembled, the conversation someone has been building toward that you've been sensing without being able to name. Maybe it's time to go in through the back door. Maybe someone has the kettle on.